They want justice. They want answers.
What stands out to you about his personality?
What's the family want most of all?
Closure.
But you were just the last person to see.
Get out
There's
of my
an arrest
yard
warrant.
and leave.
You have a lot of weighty accusations.
They were just teenagers when their lives were stolen, a murder they didn't commit in 3 decades behind bars. But the truth has a way of clawing its way to the surface, even if it takes 30 years. This is the story of Brian Boyles and Charles Collins, 2 boys 17 years old who in 1994 were convicted of murdering an 85-year-old man in Harlem, New York. They were locked away for decades, their innocence buried under lies, coercion, and flawed justice. And now, in 2025, the truth has finally come out. Let's start with the murder of James Reed. On February 8th in 1994, 85-year-old James Reed was found dead in his Harlem apartment. It was a brutal scene. He had been beaten, gagged, and strangled with a telephone cord, and there were signs of a struggle, massive struggle. The killer left behind a violent mystery, but no witnesses, no clear motive, and no forensic trail. At the time, police had no solid suspects, but a week later, everything changed, not because of any new evidence in Mr. Reed's murder, but because of a separate crime. That's when 2 teenagers, Brian Boyles and Charles Collins, were arrested for robbing a friend of Brian's, a man named Bernell Meeks. It was during questioning about that robbery that the murder case took a turn that would ultimately derail both of their lives. See, Brian Boyles was just 17 at the time of his arrest. He lived in the same building as the murder victim, James Reed. Charles Collins, also 17, was staying with Brian, which to me indicates he had some kind of troubles in his home life if he was staying with a friend. That proximity, being neighbors to the murder victim, would soon become investigators' key theory on the case, and without evidence to back it up, they leaned heavily on something else: pressure. Detectives began questioning Brian about the robbery, then suddenly pivoted, asking about Mr. Reed's murder. He denied it at first, but then detectives lied to him. They told him a neighbor saw him outside the victim's apartment, and that was false. They told Charles, his friend, another 17-year-old, had implicated him. Also false. Brian, a teenager, was scared, traumatized, and alone. No attorney, no parent, and no protection. He was interrogated for hours, handcuffed to a chair, sleep-deprived, and repeatedly threatened. First off, a teenager should never be interrogated without an adult, somebody representing them. And normally, police would need some kind of written consent that the teen is willing to talk without an adult present. So it makes sense that eventually he broke. Brian confessed. He even wrote a statement and repeated it on video. Then police showed that video to his friend, fellow 17-year-old Charles Collins. Under similar pressure, Charles gave his own statement, also confessing another false statement. And just like that, police had what looked like a solved case. 2 confessions, 2 teens admitted to committing this murder, and that was enough. But moving forward, this case was a case without evidence. They didn't have any physical evidence. No fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, and no forensic link between either teen or the victim. Even more troubling, prosecutors withheld crucial evidence that could have changed everything. There was a forensic report showing that Charles, his boots, did not match the footprints at the scene. The report said the impressions were too partial to compare, but at trial, a detective testified on the stand the opposite, telling jurors that the boots did match. It's an unbelievable, flat-out lie on a stand, an officer who perjured himself. Then there were witness interviews showing that James Reed was seen alive for hours after the supposed time of his murder, which the confession said happened between 12 and 1 p.m. In fact, neighbors saw Reed alive and well in the evening and heard dragging sounds in his apartment around 10:30 p.m. All of this exculpatory evidence never presented to the defense, never heard by the jury. Charles took a plea deal, fearing he'd face the same fate as Brian at trial. Brian, meanwhile, tried to recant his confession before his trial even began, but the damage was already done. So Charles was sentenced to 20 years to life and Brian 25 years to life in prison. They were both convicted for a murder they did not commit. Now, I can't even imagine how scared and helpless they must have felt at 17 years old, knowing they didn't do this, and their life was forever changed, just stripped away. And now they're sitting each day in prison, all throughout their 20s, all throughout their 30s, just sitting knowing that you did not do this crime. 3 decades were lost. Charles served 22 years, Brian 30. All the while, both maintained their innocence. Both admitted to the robbery, but not the murder. They never stopped fighting to clear their names. So while in prison, Brian Boyles, he didn't let the system break him. He enrolled in the Bard College Prison Initiative. So in May of 2025, he graduated with a bachelor's degree in sociology. He began mentoring others, focusing on restorative justice, determined to help those society has forgotten. And then finally, the truth, it started to surface. It came in the form of new DNA and new hope. In 2022, Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg created the Post-Conviction Justice Unit, a team dedicated to righting past wrongs. They partnered with the Innocence Project, who represented Brian Boyles, and the law firm Ropes and Gray, who represented Charles Collins. The team began a very thorough reinvestigation. And then came this breakthrough, the DNA breakthrough. The Office of Chief Medical Examiner retested the DNA collected from under James Reed's fingernails, a sample that they never had been properly able to analyze because the modern technology just didn't exist until now. The DNA did not match Brian Boyles or Charles Collins. It likely belonged to the real killer. This alone was devastating for the original case, but the investigation went further, revealing not just scientific proof of innocence, but a pattern of deception, misconduct, and due process violations that rendered both trials fundamentally unfair. District Attorney Bragg joined the motion to vacate the convictions, so in court the judge granted the motion dismissing the indictment entirely. Brian and Charles were finally exonerated. So let's dive into how false confessions happen. It actually happens more than you think. So why would anyone confess to something they didn't do, right? That's on our minds. It is a fair question, and yet the answer is quite sobering because it happens much more than you think. And it happens mainly with younger people, especially when associated with some kind of trauma or fear. The manipulation are part of the interrogation process. So nearly 1/3 of all known wrongful convictions involved a false confession. And of those, 1/3 came from minors. Let's take a closer look at how and why something like this could happen, right? So when people are brought in for questioning by police, they're expected to tell the truth. Most of us assume the same applies to police officers, investigators. But the reality is police are legally allowed to lie during interrogations, and it happens more than you think. But why would they lie? Well, it's strategic. It's to pressure somebody into confessing to a crime they believe that the person committed, even if they're innocent. Officers might falsely claim they have fingerprint evidence or that a co-defendant already confessed, or like in Brian's case, that their friend has turned on them, even though it's not true. So that's what happened in the infamous case of the exonerated five, formerly known as the Central Park Five. Police told each teen that the other had confessed. Minors are especially vulnerable. The brain's decision-making and judgment centers aren't even fully developed until the mid to late 20s, and police know this as well, so some exploit it. Of the 375 DNA exonerations tracked by the Innocence Project, 29% involved false confessions. Among exonerees who were wrongly convicted as children, 34% falsely confessed, compared to just 10% of adults. And it's not just about threats. Officers may pretend to be friendly. They may say, help us understand what happened, and they may promise leniency. But in reality, it's just simply overwhelming pressure skilled with isolating these kids. Right now, police deception is legal in every U.S. state, but some are taking action like Illinois, Oregon, and Utah. They have passed laws banning deception during juvenile interrogations. And in New York, a Senate bill was passed which would ban police lies and require judges to assess whether confession was actually reliable and not just whether it was technically voluntary. So the distinction matters because when someone is pressured to confess through lies or isolation, their words may be anything but truthful. And in the case of Brian Boyles and Charles Collins, these lies cost them 30 years of their life. So let's go into the history of interrogation and the reform. For decades, the Reed technique was the gold standard for interrogation in the U.S. It encourages deception, psychological pressure, and confrontation. But as wrongful convictions mounted, that method became under fire. Cases like the Central Park Five exposed the danger of these tactics. In each case, teenagers confessed to horrific crimes they didn't commit after police lied, isolated, or psychologically cornered them. Since 2021, 11 states have passed laws banning deception during youth interrogation. California, Illinois, Virginia, Colorado, and others. In New York, they've introduced legislation that would require youth under 18 to consult with a lawyer before being questioned by police. It would also make any statement obtained without the consultation inadmissible in court. It hasn't passed just yet, but the momentum is building for it. So what is the gain for police to push these confessions? Sometimes it's pressure, a high-profile case, community fear, or it's political optics. But sometimes police genuinely believe they have the right person. And once that belief system hardens, everything else, it just becomes out of focus. That is all they fixate on. And other times, unfortunately, it's just about statistics, solving the case, getting an answer that the public will accept and that they want. But the acceptance often comes at the cost of justice and of truth, right? It is waking up every single day, in this case, for 30 years, missing birthdays, graduations, funerals, losing decades of your life to a lie. Now imagine clawing your way back into a society that barely remembers who you are. That is the reality right now for Brian Boyles and Charles Collins. That's what is ahead of them. But yet they emerge with grace after all of this time. Brian has earned his college degree and he wants to help others. He's not bitter, he says. He's focused. But the truth remains, and no apology or settlement or even exoneration can really restore the 30 stolen years. The New York DA, Alvin Bragg, said, "We cannot undo the harm to their lives, but it's never too late to do the right thing." And maybe doing what is right means more than just vacating a conviction. It means preventing the next one. It means stopping false confessions before they happen and protecting youth. Sadly, this isn't the first wrongful conviction case that I've covered. It does seem to take at least 10 years to get any kind of fight towards the process of freedom. But the New York DA is setting a good example by re-examining some of these cases. And not everyone is innocent that says they are, but it's important to re-examine for the ones that are innocent. In the second case we're covering on this episode of Killer Genes, what happens when there's no body, no confession, no forensic evidence, and yet someone is convicted of first-degree murder? This is the story of Jerry Dale Meek, an Oklahoma man convicted in 2013 of murdering his wife, Hope Meek, a woman who vanished without a trace back in 2002. No crime scene, no witness, no body. And at the center of it all, a handwritten goodbye note that the jury never saw. Was it a clever cover-up of a cold-blooded murder or a tragic case of vanishing justice? This is the Hope and Jerry Meek story. Let's start with the disappearance of Hope Meek. She disappeared on February 21st of 2002. She was 25 years old, a mother of 3. She was biracial, Native American and white, the same actually ethnicity as I am, and on the verge of earning a degree in criminal justice. She was working part-time at the McCurtain County Sheriff's Department. That Thursday, her husband, Jerry Meek, claimed He last saw her at 3 p.m. before taking the children camping. He returned home at midnight, citing cold weather, and they had to come back, but Hope was gone. Her truck still there. Her purse, glasses, and cell phone, all untouched. Her life was just frozen in place. Even more suspicious, Jerry didn't even report her missing for over 5 days. Hope wasn't the type to just vanish now. She called her mother every single day. She was working, studying, parenting. She had responsibilities and routines, and she had a life plan. Let's go back in time to before the disappearance, to before the courtroom, to when Hope Meek was just a girl from Wellsville, Ohio. Born in 1977, Hope dropped out of high school at 16 to marry her first husband, Brian Kidd. She had her first daughter, Jamie, at 19, but by 1999, that relationship had ended. She then went on to marry Jerry Meek, but she was only 22 years old. She was still so young. They had a son that same month. So things were moving very quickly for this new couple. Now, the couple settled in Valiant, Oklahoma, a town where none of Hope's extended family lived. Still, Hope, she made it work. She worked at a local Easy Mart, took college classes, cared for her children. Her coworkers said she never missed work unless the kids were sick, and even then, she would call ahead. Her friends and mother described her as a doting, loving mother, so what could possibly go wrong? Here comes in the battle of narratives. In court, Hope's marriage was painted with two opposing brushes. The prosecution presented her as a devoted mother tethered to her kids and building a better life. But Jerry Meek's defense told another story, that she was checked out, unhappy, that she resented motherhood and sought to abort their youngest child, that she had a secret boyfriend and simply she just walked away from him in their life. To support this, Jerry's team portrayed him as the stable one, the family man. He came straight home from work, he helped with the kids, he played with them, bought the milk, changed the diapers, all that. But witnesses on both sides admitted the marriage was rocky. Hope reportedly grew nervous whenever Jerry would just show up. There were even hints of control. Hope had quietly looked into some self-defense classes for domestic abuse survivors, so the picture was anything but clear. So now what's going to count as evidence when it comes to his trial? It took 10 years before Jerry Meek was finally arrested, and in 2012, new investigators reopened this cold case. By 2013, Jerry stood trial without a body, confession, or any forensic evidence. So what did work? Legally, it's possible under Jackson versus Virginia, a jury can convict based on circumstantial evidence if it's strong enough to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. So in Hope's case, prosecutors pointing to her complete disappearance from family, work, and financial life, the fact that she left behind everything, including her paycheck, Jerry's delay in reporting her missing, and his move to file for divorce and gain custody just 2 weeks later. That's suspicious. Motive, opportunity, and a deeply fractured marriage painted a picture the jury accepted. Now this goodbye note that keeps being referenced. Here's where things get a little bit murky. 2 days after the prosecution rested, Jerry's attorney tried to introduce a handwritten letter they claimed was from Hope, and it was a goodbye note. They said Jerry found it a month after she vanished in his lunchbox. The note, if believed, could have suggested that Hope left voluntarily, but the court rejected it because it wasn't shared with the prosecution beforehand, and it hadn't come up in opening arguments. It wasn't part of the original evidence, and Jerry himself had never mentioned it, not even during a 2003 guardianship hearing about the children. So the judge just basically called it incredible that the jury never saw it, and it didn't have any weight to carry. So when it comes to the trial and conviction, the trial testimony had a witness, Antoinette, a friend from school that was very close to Hope. They'd always used to talk about their kids and feeling that she was so proud about going to school and trying to better her life. And they talked about Hope getting into this self-defense class for women who had gone through domestic violence. So she did have a witness to that. The friend went on to say that she didn't want anyone to know that she was going to the classes, and that when it came to the separation between her and Jerry, that is when hope changed and it brought her back to life, saying, quote, she became more active and more talkative, and she was learning that there was a better life ahead for her. So she was particularly proud that she had picked up the pieces. She bought a pickup truck and was going to school, and she was reclaiming her life and her independence. A witness from the daycare testified in court that Hope had laughed to her and bragged about slashing Jerry Meek's tires over an argument pertaining to money. And Jerry Meek made the following statement in his testimony, saying that Hope said that the family court judge, quote, isn't going to give a man custody of a kid unless they can prove that the mother's unfit. He went on, well, when a judge hears everything you've done, there ain't no way he will give you custody of our son. And she said, you can't prove anything. He went on to say if he went through with a divorce, he has no doubt that she would have gotten custody of their son. And he said at one point during the relationship, he had walked in the front door of their home and found Hope laying on the couch wearing just a t-shirt, no panties, nothing. And over the right side of the room was a boyfriend she was sleeping with, sitting in his recliner. Now, it was 2013 when Jerry Meek was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The evidence was entirely circumstantial. Hope's disappearance without a trace, the state of Meek's marriage, and the good father versus the restless mother contrast, and Jerry's suspicious behavior after her disappearance. The jury believed the totality of evidence was enough, given the fact that there was no body or no confession, so they found him guilty. When it comes to a recent appeal just in 2023, he appealed arguing ineffective counsel. Some of the core issues were his attorney failed to properly submit the goodbye note, and his attorney didn't object when an agent testified that Jerry had invoked his rights to counsel, a comment that could show bias towards a jury. So the appellate court reviewed the case from scratch, and they found both actions questionable, but ultimately not enough to overturn his conviction. The reasoning were the errors were minor in the context of the overall trial. When it comes to no-body cases, there's a book out from a former prosecutor, Tad DiBiase, if I'm pronouncing that right. He runs the NoBodyMurderCases.com website, and he has documented that there are about 600 no-body murder cases across the U.S., and he reports that approximately 86% of these result in conviction, roughly in line with the overall U.S. homicide conviction rate. Now, overall, no-body cases only make up 1% of cases because it needs to be meticulous and detailed, and the circumstantial evidence has to be tight. Here's another thing about no-body cases. There's always a hole, a missing piece, a question that lingers. If Jerry did it, where is Hope? If he didn't, where did she go? No murder weapon, no remains, and no final goodbye to her kids. Just a conviction and a family divided, and children now raised without their mother, and a man spending the rest of his life in prison. In a case that some call a triumph of reason and others call a miscarriage of justice. That's the toll of cases like these, the gaping wound of uncertainty, the grief with no grave. So what do you think? Was Jerry Meek guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? Should the goodbye note have been entered for the jury to see? Can we trust a verdict built on silence and suspicion? Hope Meek, she would have been 48 years old today. Her body has never been found, but the state of Oklahoma, they believe they found her killer. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Killer Genes. If you haven't yet, hit subscribe.